Karen's voice cracked with rage as she stood at the gate, pointing like a judge delivering a sentence, claiming a farm that was never hers. Behind her, trucks idled, vendors whispered, and the sheriff's car rolled in, summoned not for justice, but to force a man off his own land. What followed would shatter reputations, expose lies, and turn neighbors into enemies. Before we begin, tap that like button and tell in the comments where you're watching from. Karen plants herself at the gate like a verdict, wristbands dangling from her hand as if they were deeds, claiming a farm her board never bought, never earned, never touched with anything but entitlement, and the muscles in her jaw telegraph how far she's ready to go to save a party built on someone else's land and someone else's name. So who actually owns this night when the truth walks out to meet it? Ethan steps forward without raising his voice, the kind of calm that makes a crowd lean in, telling her the gate stays closed and the ground stays honest. And he says it the way a son carries a promise to a mother who fought developers with paperwork and grit. So why does a volunteer on Karen's side suddenly stop smiling like he just remembered what honesty feels like? Trucks exhale, vendors hover, and Karen orders security to cut the chain while streaming herself for the board, selling a story of cooperation and community. And Ethan answers that the only permit that counts here is the deed inked in sacrifice, the easement that forbids crowds and generators, the clause that turns a festival into a fire trap. So what happens when performance collides with proof in front of thousands of watching eyes? A neighbor Ethan once trusted slides beside Karen and tells him to let it happen just once, promising it will help property values and make everyone friends again. And Ethan looks at him the way a storm looks at an umbrella, asking why friendship always shows up holding a receipt. So who taught people to call it unity when it is only pressure with a smile? Karen raises her phone and says the sheriff will handle the situation, saying handle like the word is a lever, and Ethan reminds her the badge protects ownership, not ambition, while a teenager across the road starts a live stream that hums with comments waiting for someone to blink first. So who blinks when a lie meets a live feed in the middle of a secret everyone can see? A vendor steps up with a clipboard and a contract carrying Ethan's address and a signature that looks almost right except for the tremor of fraud along the edge, and Karen claims it's binding. And Ethan calls it counterfeit with the kind of certainty only grief can sharpen. So whose pen traced a family name to turn a legacy into a prop? His phone buzzes with a message from the pharmacy that a delivery driver can't reach the house because the entrance is blocked by rentals and ambition, and Ethan pushes through the grid just to clear a path, and someone films him like he's the problem, while Karen posts that an aggressive owner is endangering the community. So who wins when the first rumor arrives wearing a uniform tone? He calls his lawyer and repeats the easement terms like a blade, the fire access requirement like a second blade, and Karen's guard whispers that the sheriff is bringing a deputy who isn't just a deputy, but also her boyfriend, and the teenager's comments turn sharp enough to cut the silence. So what does fair look like when the traffic cones come holding a relationship? In the middle of that pressure, Ethan lifts his head and says this gate stays honest until someone reads the law out loud. And he asks anyone watching to lock the moment in with a like and to write where they are watching from, saying witnesses make truth heavier and easier to carry. So will strangers from 1,000 towns become the weight that keeps a promise from being moved? Security returns with cutters bright enough to steal attention, and Ethan warns that cutting a family lock without authority is still a crime even when a board applauds it. And Karen answers that the board has spoken as if votes can buy geography. And someone snorts because the line between bold and reckless just got audited. So who pays when a board spends courage it never earned? Another message lands from a blocked number suggesting that if Ethan cooperates, the talk of liens and fines will disappear, the kind of message that smells like a backroom and a handshake no one should accept. And Ethan hands the screen to the teenager, who reads it out loud for the world. So how long can pressure hide when a chorus of strangers says read that again? A vendor confesses quietly that cash pickups happened in parking lots and the badge on a hired inspector peeled like a sticker, and Karen tells him to focus on setup as if conscience can be scheduled, and Ethan pockets the confession for later because now the sound of authority is coming up the road. So what happens when the story meets the archive, and the archive has a siren? 2 patrol cars roll in with the calm of people who have seen worse than parties and wristbands. And Karen lifts her arm like she owns the road and points to Ethan like a problem to be removed, and the deputy steps out with eyes that know her too well. So which way does the first decision fall when loyalty meets law at a gate that refuses to forget its promise? Karen frames the moment like a coronation, wristbands looped on her fingers as if they were keys to other people's sacrifices, calling it a charity gala that lifts the neighborhood, while her board pretends the land beneath her feet agreed to be borrowed. So why does generosity feel like a bill shoved under a door? The treasurer from the HOA edges in with a clipboard and a smile that has numbers hiding behind it, talking about dues increases and community prestige and future property values, promising that tonight will pay for a playground and scholarships. So why does every promise arrive with a receipt that someone else must sign? A vendor produces a rental contract with Ethan's address spelled perfectly and a signature that almost fits the way his name curls. And he studies the loop on the final letter like a fingerprint and says the hand that wrote this never held his mother's deed. So who taught a pen to imitate grief this cleanly? Karen tells the deputy on speaker that the owner is obstructing an approved community event and that the board acted in good faith, and Ethan answers that good faith does not carry bolt cutters and forged ink, while the vendor's eyes flicker because the story he was sold just lost its shine. So who pays back the difference when truth ruins the markup? A neighbor Ethan trusted for years steps up with calm advice to let them use the field once to reset tensions and make the board look reasonable. And Ethan asks how reason works if it requires pretending the boundary never existed. And the neighbor swallows because friendship is cheaper than principle until a receipt demands to be read out loud. So what kind of friend asks you to misplace your name? Trucks keep arriving as if momentum could turn wrong into right through sheer volume. And an assistant from the HOA announces that wristbands were pre-sold and influencers are already en route with sponsorship obligations and countdown posts. And Ethan replies that obligations are not authority and that a live stream cannot substitute for consent. So when did an audience become a weapon? Karen posts an update calling the owner aggressive for blocking a family fundraiser, and the comments surge with people who were never here. And the teenager across the road streams the forged signature and the bolt cutters, and the board smiles without a filter. So whose version calcifies first when speed tries to outrun fact? Ethan's phone rings with the pharmacy driver saying the delivery can't get past the gate because the convoy is stacked like a dare, and he clears a lane with steady hands while someone films him like a villain relocating props. And Karen whispers to the treasurer to keep cameras on him because optics shape policy. So why does service look like sabotage when the timeline needs a villain? The clipboard trembles when a vendor admits cash changed hands in parking lots, and that a so-called city badge peeled like a sticker on a hot day. And Karen clamps down with a bored voice that orders focus on setup as if integrity were a distraction. And Ethan thanks the vendor by name because gratitude is heavier than pressure when witnesses are listening. So what breaks first when a quiet admission collides with a loud schedule? A volunteer barely older than the teenager confesses she was promised a glowing reference if she handled the farmer and kept the vibe friendly. And Ethan tells her that no celebration is worth burning a future and sends her to her mother with a nod that looks like shelter. So how many small hopes were fed to this party so a bigger hope could sell out the view? The deputy finally arrives with the kind of confidence that assumes the decision is already written, and Karen greets him like relief dressed in uniform, while the teenager's chat asks the only question that matters, and Ethan stands with a folder that carries easement terms strong enough to erase tense with a sentence. So what happens when a relationship meets a clause that does not bend for romance? The sheriff steps out with slower steps than politics likes and asks for the permit. And Karen produces a stamped sheet that smells like fresh ink and old audacity. And Ethan lays down the deed and the fire access requirement that turns crowds into fines and generators into violations. So why does the treasurer suddenly need water when the math finally includes criminal risk? A phone pings on Karen's table with a message she glances at and flips face down, and the teenager zooms on the corner long enough to catch one phrase about make the lien talk disappear if compliance is immediate. And Ethan's jaw tightens because coercion rarely speaks that plainly unless it believes no one can hear. So which office writes sentences that short and sharp? Another ping lands on Ethan's screen from a block number offering a clean slate and a quiet Monday if he unlocks the gate tonight. And the vendor who confessed takes a step back like he just saw the edge of the plan. And Karen says the community will remember who cooperated when progress called. So who exactly is keeping the ledger that decides who belongs? Ethan reads the message twice and hands it to the sheriff without commentary. and the deputy studies the sender with a glance that betrays familiarity, and Karen's throat tightens into a smile shaped like patience. So what name will surface when the sender is traced and the ledger is forced into daylight? The sheriff arrives measured and watchful, and the deputy steps out with a practiced nod toward Karen that looks too familiar to be procedural, a tilt that says decisions might already be warmed up for serving. So who trusts the table when the host and the waiter are dating? Karen produces a permit with a fresh seal and the confidence of someone rehearsed, and the treasurer's chin lifts like interest compounded, while Ethan lays down the deed that carries the weight of his mother's relentless ink and the easement language that turns crowds into violations and wristbands into liabilities. So what wins when a stamp meets a signature carved by loss? The deputy schemes the deed like a headline and calls it a private dispute, but Ethan points to the emergency access clause that forbids mass gatherings and generator placements in blocked lanes. And the vendor who confessed earlier looks at his shoes as if they've learned to blush. So how many rules have to stack before someone admits gravity still works? The sheriff asks for supporting notes, and Ethan presents time-stamped emails from the fire marshal warning about open flame near dry feed and temporary wiring over fuel, and Karen counters that safety will be top tier once the show starts, which is like promising seatbelts after the crash. So why do some plans only include caution tape after the siren? The teenager's stream keeps climbing and comments slice through the noise, and Ethan invites eyes to the seal number on Karen's paper while he traces the digits with a steady finger, asking if anyone recognizes that sequence from public records already posted. So what happens when the public archive outpaces private bravado? Karen signals to security and the cutters return gleaming with borrowed certainty, and she orders the chain removed under authority of the board, calling it a community mandate. And Ethan answers that community without consent is only a crowd with better fonts. So when did branding start masquerading as law? The deputy moves to intervene, and the sheriff holds out a hand for one more look, squinting at the seal that seems to echo from another project, and Ethan says one line in this deed ends the debate before anyone reaches metal, and he asks everyone watching who has ever defended their home to write what they would do in the comments. And if they feel this moment in their chest to drop a heart, so he knows they're still with him. So will 1,000 witnesses pull this gate heavier than one? Counterfeit stamp? Karen laughs thinly and tells the deputy to proceed because delays cost sponsors, and the treasurer whispers that refunds will bury the budget and the election is a month away, which makes the board's urgency look less like leadership and more like survival. So whose reputation is being rented by the hour? Ethan flips to the deed addendum, the sentence his mother fought to include, the one that grants immediate injunctive relief against any organized assembly that obstructs medical access to the residents. And he reads it steady while the pharmacy driver texts that delivery is still blocked. So what argument remains when medicine is the plaintiff? The sheriff takes the addendum and the permit and places them side by side like two stories told at the same table, then asks where the permit was issued and by whom, and the deputy answers the county office in a tone that sounds borrowed. So why does the word county feel lighter than it should when it lands? A vendor steps up again and admits the badge he saw on an inspector earlier had a glossy edge that peeled, and Karen warns him to stop spreading confusion. But the stream catches his face and the truth in his exhale. So how far can a sticker carry authority before sweat and questions lift the corner? Ethan calls out the fire access line again, this time for the viewers counting the violations in real time. And he adds that the easement holds regardless of signatures later discovered invalid. A simple statement that makes the cutters look suddenly heavier. So when the script changes, who puts their prop down first? The deputy waves security forward and the sheriff says hold. Then radios the county clerk for verification, giving the seal number twice and the event title once. And the line clicks with the kind of pause that lives between yes and perjury. So what truth is wrestling for breath on the other end? Karen urges action and invokes goodwill, children's programs, scholarships waiting on tonight's success, and Ethan replies that charity cannot trespass, that help without permission becomes harm with a receipt, and the teen streamers chat floods with agreement from cities and towns that know this feeling. So when an audience learns the rule, how quickly does pressure lose its costume? The treasurer edges back from Karen as if math just turned personal, mumbling about exposure and audits, and a developer who promised matching funds if access was guaranteed, and Ethan's jaw sets at the word developer like a memory stepping out of a photograph. so which old fight has returned wearing a younger face? The sheriff repeats the seal number and waits, pin hovering, while the deputy studies the gravel and doesn't meet anyone's eyes. And the radio breathes once, and then goes quiet long enough to make the cutters look absurd. So what answer is heavy enough to silence a frequency built to speak? An unmarked SUV rolls up as if it owns the outcome. Door opening to a man who introduces himself as a city inspector, badge flashed quick like a magic trick and clipboard ready to rewrite reality. And he starts with a violation for obstructing an approved event, while Karen's shoulders loosen as if she just rented the law for the evening. So who gave a stranger the power to rename trespass into charity with one page? He flips forms like a dealer and lists penalties that sound rehearsed, promising swift action if the gate is not opened for the community's benefit. And Ethan answers that benefit without permission is a cost and points to the clause that treats blocked medical access as an emergency. So why does the word emergency always make opportunists talk louder? The inspector steps closer and tells security to stand by for compliance, and the deputy nods along as if the script was mailed to him yesterday. And the teenager's stream spikes as comments ask whether city authority can cross a county line just because a board has wristbands. So when did geography become optional for convenience? Ethan's oldest neighbor slides into the moment with a calm plea to let this one happen, to restore goodwill, to stop being the headline, promising a smoother life if the board leaves smiling. And Ethan asks how goodwill survives a forged signature and a blocked pharmacy run. So what kind of peace requires a receipt that deletes a family name? The neighbor exhales and confesses that Karen offered him a board seat and influence on zoning if he helped tonight land clean, and the words hang there like a price tag no one wants to read. And the treasurer blinks because influence sounds exciting until audits ask how it was purchased. So how much is friendship worth when paid in favors with interest? The inspector lifts his chin and orders Ethan detained for interfering with a permitted assembly, and the deputy reaches for cuffs with the easy certainty of someone told this would be simple, and the sheriff measures the distance like a man who knows how fast truth can arrive when patience survives. So which comes first today, restraint or regret? Steel touches Ethan's wrists, and the teenager yells that the permit number matches a dog park plan from last year. And the chat detonates with links and screenshots that don't care about wristbands or speeches. And Karen hisses that misinformation is dangerous, while the vendor, who confessed earlier, looks like a witness trying not to be brave. So how long can a performance outrun an archive? Ethan steadies himself and says his mother fought the same developer that now smiles through shell companies and matching funds, that the easement she forced into existence was the promise he will not sell for a night of lights and sponsors. And he speaks it like a vow carried through hospital rooms and late bills. So who dares reduce grief to a staging area? The inspector waves off history as sentiment and tells security again to proceed. And Ethan answers that sentiment did not place ink on the deed or penalties in the code. And the sheriff finally raises a palm that stills hands midair, because even stubbornness respects a voice that has carried a radio longer than this board has existed. So what happens when seniority asks the first real question? The sheriff asks the inspector for his department contact and office number, and the inspector rattles something that sounds like a street rather than an agency and offers a card that gleams too fresh, and the teenager's lens captures the corner lifting at the edge of the seal. So how long can a sticker pretend to be a crest? Karen tells her volunteers to keep setup moving because sponsors do not pay for pauses, and the treasurer murmurs that refunds will snowball into a deficit big enough to drown reputations. And the neighbor takes a step back as if the math finally added up to his own name. So who still wants the seat when the chair is nailed to a subpoena? Ethan looks at the deputy and asks if the badge on his chest outranks the text on his phone, because the message about liens dissolving with compliance just appeared on the sheriff's screen, and the sender looks familiar to more than one person here. So which matter of record will survive the next 5 minutes? The deputy falters, then says the permit came from the county office and was cleared by a contact who understands community priorities, and the sheriff asks for the contact's full name and title, while the treasurer flinches at the word cleared like it was a bridge too far. So why do details wilt under daylight if everything is legitimate? The inspector argues that delay risks public order and brand reputation, and Ethan says the only brand that survives is the one that tells the truth when it hurts. And the teen streamer whispers to the viewers to hold this frame, because something is about to fall that won't get back up quick. So which pillar cracks first, the fake seal or the borrowed courage? The cuffs click open as the sheriff shakes his head and returns the deed with a care that sounds like apology, then turns to the deputy and asks him to repeat exactly where he got the permit and who handed it over, word for word, on the record, and Karen's voice thins into a smile that can't find its footing. So what answer is about to step out that makes her throat forget how to be confident? Wind slams the temporary frame, and a chandelier swings free, then snaps and drops toward the crowd as a child freezes beneath it, and Ethan moves faster than the shout, diving through metal and canvas to pull the kid clear while the frame clatters behind him. So who hesitates when a life is a decision measured in heartbeats? The child coughs against his shirt and clings hard enough to wrinkle resolve into gratitude, and Ethan passes the kid to a shaking parent with a nod that says safe counts before arguments, while Karen stares like reality just overruled marketing. So when danger chooses a side, why does it never pick the brochure? A generator sputters and spits a ribbon of sparks toward stacked fuel, and a vendor yells about a loose cap as Ethan snatches an extinguisher and pounds foam into the glow until sound and heat surrender, and the crowd exhales like an unpaid debt finally noticed. So how close did a party come to becoming evidence? The teenager's stream locks on Ethan's hands, and the numbers jump, comments flooding with praise and receipts that rewrite the narrative in real time. And if you would have jumped too, press like so this thread outruns the spin, and type your city so witnesses have a shape. So will 1,000 small signals outweigh one loud lie? The sheriff takes it in, the rescue, the extinguisher, the crowd turning, and the fake inspector's confidence thins as the glossy badge corner lifts under sweat and scrutiny, and the deputy stops nodding and starts listening. So when a mask peels at the edges, how long until the whole costume slips? A rental foreman edges close and admits cash pickups in parking lots and a script about city clearance that never came with emails, and the treasurer's pen stalls because math becomes guilt when revenue walks with counterfeit authority. So how many zeros turn courage into regret? Karen calls for setup to resume and threatens sponsor penalties if momentum dies, but the sheriff raises a hand and cites the easement and the emergency clause and the documented fire risk, and volunteers step back because liability speaks a language everyone understands. So what happens to loyalty when risk finally reads aloud? The county clerk calls back with a voice that sounds like a door locking, stating the permit number belongs to a canceled subdivision plan filed months ago, not an event, and the stamp sequence ties to a different department entirely. So who bridged that gap with the confidence of someone who thought no one would check? Silence fractures into orders as the sheriff suspends operations and requests identification from the inspector, whose badge now curls at the edge, and two deputies guide him toward a cruiser while the teenager's chat erupts with clipped screenshots and archive links. So how quickly does the internet become a ledger? Ethan waves through the pharmacy driver and volunteers form a lane with a suddenness that looks like apology, and the package passes hand to hand until it reaches the porch like a promise delivered, and comments turn from heat to human as people type gratitude without punctuation. So can a community repair itself by moving a box the right direction? Karen tries a new angle about children's programs and scholarships waiting on tonight's success. But the sheriff answers that charity cannot trespass and kindness cannot be laundered through coercion, and the deputy's eyes dim as the words land on his own decisions. So what does conscience weigh when a uniform is part of the math? Ethan addresses the vendors and volunteers first and says no one has to carry blame that was sold to them, that consent and safety always outrank spectacle, and he thanks those who stepped back before damage became legacy. And if this moment hits your gut, drop a heart so others know they are not alone. So does a simple sentence travel farther than a paid campaign? The treasurer breaks and says deposits were routed to a shell company that promised matching funds and influence, and a foreman shows chat logs where pickup locations shifted every hour, and the deputy recognizes a number he should not recognize. So which string pulls the whole knot into daylight? Karen clutches the box of wristbands as if they were lifelines and not receipts, scanning faces for allies who have already stepped away, while the neighbor who bargained for a board seat hands Ethan an apology that feels late and still needed. So who writes the price of silence when the bill finally lands? The sheriff asks the deputy to unlock his phone and forward the contact used to clear the permit, and the clerk on the radio says the login that requested the stamp came from a workstation assigned to a developer's liaison. with a partial name that freezes 3 people at once, so whose fingerprints are about to be read out loud in front of everyone. The clerk finishes the trace and drops a name tied to a developer's liaison account, and 3 faces lock in place like glass as the deputy recognizes a relative on the contact list. The treasurer recognizes the shell company address, and Karen recognizes the end of the performance, so whose reflection cracks first when every angle points the same direction. The sheriff asks for the deputy's phone, and the screen blooms with threads that should never meet court lighting, timestamps against permit requests, a promise that the crowd will arrive before questions do, and a line about smoothing liens if cooperation looks good on camera. So how many messages does it take to turn loyalty into evidence? The treasurer stops pretending courage is optional and forwards bank screenshots to the sheriff, and the auditor deposits labeled gala access drifting into a shell named Northbridge Social, then out to a consultant who invoices influence, and a second sheet linking the consultant to the developer through a shared mailbox. So where exactly does generosity end and laundering begin? The fire marshal arrives carrying authority shaped like consequence and reads off violations with the speed of someone who warned them already. Temporary wiring over fuel containers, no egress plan, blocked medical access, and orders a halt that sounds final enough to cancel speeches. So what argument survives when safety has receipts? The county auditor steps through with a folder of contracts and notes on dues hikes that outpaced maintenance, and a memo promising matching funds if a private venue was secured, and the numbers stare back like a confession wearing a suit. So when did prestige become the most expensive hobby in town? Ethan's lawyer arrives with the injunction drafted and ready, names filled, clauses sharpened, penalties outlined with teeth, and the sheriff nods once and says operations are suspended pending service, which to everyone here sounds like the gate finally speaking. So what do wristbands buy when a sentence shuts them down? A volunteer barely older than the streamer approaches with shaking hands and says she was promised a glowing reference and an internship if she kept the farmer calm on camera, and Ethan thanks her for saying the hard part out loud and sends her to call her mother from a safe place. So how many futures were gambled for a night that was never theirs to sell? The deputy reads his own messages again, and the words look different when spoken back to him. Then he texts Karen to leave while she can, and the sheriff catches the flick of guilt across his face and takes the device like it was never really his. So who chooses to be a witness when the floor opens? A vendor confesses the inspector's badge peeled at the edge and that cash pickups moved every hour to new lots. And the inspector in the cruiser shouts about misunderstanding while the chat churns with archived logos and LinkedIn pages stitched together by strangers who refuse to be gaslit. So how fast can a town crowdsource the truth? Karen tries to turn the crowd by invoking children's programs and a scholarship list waiting for tonight's proceeds. But the teenagers stream reruns the chandelier falling and the extinguisher hissing in Ethan's hands, and the comments decide that safety counts more than speeches. So what script survives when the audience edits live? The neighbor who bargained for a board seat returns the favor in plain language and offers to testify on the promise he accepted and regrets. And he hands Ethan an apology that lands heavy and needed, a small stone added to the right side of the scale. So how many small stones does it take to shift a town? If you have ever watched Power bend the rules and felt that sting in your chest, tap like, so this story reaches the next person who needs a spine today, and tell where you're watching from, so the ledger of witnesses has lines that stretch past this fence. So will a scattered crowd become the chorus that keeps this honest? The sheriff reads preliminary charges to the inspector and begins a conflict of interest review on the deputy, while internal affairs is notified, and the fire marshal writes citations that add up like a thunderclap, and wristbands in Karen's hands start to look like receipts that refuse to be thrown away. So what does a leader do when the props become exhibits? The treasurer whispers that refunds will break the budget and make the next election a reckoning, and the auditor replies that elections are cleaner than courtrooms if people act now. And eyes turn to Karen because her decision writes more than a headline. So does she choose apology or arson of reputation? Ethan speaks to the volunteers first because they were used as cover, telling them they owe no loyalty to a lie and that going home is an act of courage when the crowd expects noise, and people begin to lower lanyards like they're dropping a story they no longer want. So who still stands when applause stops renting the air? The clerk calls again with the workstation location that requested the stamp, And it isn't the county office, but a terminal registered to a property management suite leased by the developer and accessed yesterday from an IP that also logs into the HOA's account. So how many doors connect when arrogance forgets it left footprints? The sheriff turns back to Karen and asks for the remaining permit copies, the sponsorship contracts, and the ledger of wristband sales, and her fingers tense around the box like it might still float on a sea that just turned to concrete. So does she hand over the paper trail or light the match that ends her version forever? Karen holds the box of wristbands tight enough to turn cardboard into confession, then loosens her grip and sets it on the hood beside the sponsorship contracts and forged copies. A small surrender that sounds louder than shouting as the sheriff takes custody and the crowd finally exhales as if a spell just broke. So what choice remains when evidence decides to breathe on its own? The inspector sits in the cruiser with a badge that now looks like a sticker peeled off a costume, and the sheriff reads charges that carry real weight, while the deputy is relieved of duty pending review. And the vendors who were used as props trade looks that mix anger with relief because truth finally rented a louder microphone. So how quickly does courage return when the script that trapped it gets pulled apart? The county clerk confirms the workstation trace, and the auditor flags the shell company as a funnel tied to the developer's liaison, and the announcement spreads from phone to phone until the board's reputation is not a platform but a liability. And Karen signs a statement with trembling letters that point toward a plea. So what does leadership mean when the only path forward is admitting the road was paved with lies? The treasurer turns whistleblower and forwards the full ledger of wristband sales with bank routes and pickup logs, promising restitution as the first step and transparency as the second. And neighbors who stayed quiet earlier start sending confirmations that they were pitched the same plan with different smiles. So how many versions of the same pressure does a town need before it calls the pressure by its name? Ethan asks first for refunds to volunteers and vendors who were misled, then for the remainder to go to real scholarships through an independent fund managed by people who never needed a gala to be generous. And the sheriff agrees to freeze assets while the court sorts the pieces into something resembling justice. So can money ever be cleaned without admitting the stain that made it shine? The teenager edits a compilation that stitches together the chandelier drop, the extinguisher hiss, the forged seal, the lane opening for the pharmacy delivery, and the radio confirmation that ended the performance. And it spreads faster than the lie that started the night, because people share relief quicker than outrage when relief feels earned. So what lasts longer online, spectacle or repair? The neighbor who bargained for a board seat writes a public apology that lands with plain words and full responsibility, and he offers testimony that names dates, calls, and promises, and he helps carry equipment back to trucks with the quiet diligence of someone who finally found the line he refuses to cross again. So how many small repairs equal one honest bridge? Ethan walks the package of medication to his father and watches a calm settle that no headline can counterfeit. And the old man studies his son and says without flourish that promises kept outlive parties, a sentence that fits in a pocket and still weighs more than 1,000 wristbands. So which inheritance matters when the music stops? The child Ethan pulled from beneath the chandelier returns the next day with a lopsided box of cookies and a drawing of a hand grabbing another hand. And the parent cannot stop repeating that one decisive step changed everything. And even the deputy hears it from down the road and looks away because consequence has a sound that doesn't need sirens. So what single motion will your neighborhood remember you for? 1 month later, the farm holds a free harvest night with no wristbands and no gate games. Only neighbors who choose to stand side by side without receipts. And the teenager plays an acoustic set, while kids chase one another between hay bales that are only hay bales, and the treasurer brings receipts stamped paid back to the community fund as if numbers can bow when they are finally honest. So what does celebration feel like when permission is the headline? The fire marshal arrives as a guest who smiles with relief instead of writing citations, and the sheriff stands with a paper cup and no authority in his hands because none is needed when people police themselves with character. And the deputy passes in plain clothes on his way to a hearing that will decide the rest of his uniform story. So how far does a badge travel without the trust that made it mean anything? Karen's lawyer delivers a plea and a public statement for restitution and community service read aloud by the auditor, and a low murmur ripples through the crowd that is not joy or cruelty, but a complicated mercy that towns learn only after bruises, and no one cheers because justice here is not a sport. So what is the sound of accountability when it arrives without a parade? Ethan lifts a small wooden sign that belonged to his mother and hangs it back on the gate. Words carved by a hand that never learned surrender, community welcome and consent required. And beside it he nails one wristband from the night everything tried to tilt, not as a trophy, but as a warning. So how many times must a boundary be taught before it becomes a reflex? He thanks the volunteers who chose truth when pressure leaned hard, and he thanks the quiet ones who came back to stand in the light after hiding in the shade. And he turns to the kid he saved and asks him to be the first to try the palette stage with a story about courage measured in steps. And the kid steps up with a grin that says a lesson went in the right direction. So who are we training to guard the next promise without being asked? If this stand for home and dignity pulled at something inside you, tap like so it reaches the next person who needs it, and subscribe so you are here for the next story of people refusing to be rented. And tell in the comments where you're watching from and which line in your own life you would defend with both hands. Because witness is the quiet armor that never rusts. So when your gate is tested, will you remember tonight? The crowd stays late and the music turns soft and the sign on the gate glows with nothing mystical at all. Just the worn courage of ordinary people who chose the harder right over the comfortable wrong. And the teen streamer scans faces that look lighter than the weather because truth is a weight until it is shared. So when the next board, badge, or brand leans against your door with a smile, what answer will you have ready?